In this video, I want to take a pretty in-depth look at the audience reports in Google Analytics. The audience section is filled with information that helps us understand characteristics of our site viewers. That includes location and language information, device information, operating system used, and even browser information. There are even audience reports that describe a user's behavior over multiple visits to our site, like how often they're visiting and where they're coming from. In general, the audience section is giving us insight into our users' demographics and what mix of new and returning users that we have, their engagement level, and how they're accessing our site. What I want to do first is go through each report as an overview, and then we'll come back and dive deeper into the most useful reports. But by the end, you should have a pretty good grasp of what each report can provide, so you can then decide which reports are most beneficial for your business. The first report we're reviewing is the overview. And just like the title denotes, the overview gives us snippets of some of the reports. The top graph is currently set to sessions, but we can change that to any number of metrics and also select a comparison metric, just like we looked at on the location reports. Below the graph on the right, we can see a pie chart showing the percentage of new versus returning users. If I scroll down, you can see that we have the option to view language, location, and browser information. We can look at operating system of the mobile device certain users are viewing our site through. So a pretty good overview of audience data right from the start. The next report is active users. And what this shows us is the amount of unique users you have visiting your site over a certain period of time. Right now, you can see the 1-day active users box is checked in the top left above the graph. What that means is every single one of the plotted days is showing us the number of unique users for that day. I've set the time period of 1 month, October 29th through November 28th. So each point on the graph is 1 day of the 30-day time period. If I hover over any point on the graph, we'll see the unique users for that day. Then below the graph, we have 4 boxes. 1-day active users, 7-day active users, 14-day active users, and 30-day active users. And what this gives us is the total unique visitors to our site beginning with the last day of the time period we selected. So the 1-day active user is the last day of the time period I selected, or November 28th. There was 1 visitor on November 28th. Then the 7-day active users is the total unique visitors to my site for the last 7 days of the time period I selected. And the same with 14 and 30-day active users. Now we can affect the graph by selecting one or more of the checkboxes above. Let's click on the 7-day active users box. See how the graph changes to superimpose the 7-day graph over the 1-day graph? What this does is it gives us the ability to hover over any point and get the previous 7-day total as well as the 1-day total unique viewers to our site. The next report is called Cohort Analysis. A cohort is a group of users that share a common characteristic, and that characteristic is going to be defined by your cohort type. In this case, acquisition date is selected. We can then choose the metric. Right now, user retention is selected, but there are other options like goal completion per user or page views per user. All the users that share the same acquisition date belong to the same cohort. And this report allows us to see what happens to the cohort over time. And this is a great view for certain business goals, so you will want to spend some time exploring this report to see what type of information might be relevant to your business. The next reports are our demographic reports. And these reports allow us to understand the age and gender makeup of our audience. With this, we can tailor our content to reflect the demographics of our audience, or even change our content if we want to target a specific gender or age range. For instance, if our audience skews younger, we should consider current design trends and language. But just remember that everything about our site, from design, language, graphics, and how technically sophisticated it is, plays into the type of audience that will interact with our site. The next report group we have is interest reports. And this is a pretty cool thing Google does. What it does is it gives us a context for directing our content and advertising into related markets, which are known as affinity categories. These are things that our users have in common. For instance, 15% of my users during the time period I've selected are technophiles. So this report helps us know what things our users identify with so that we may engage them from that direction. The next are geographical reports, and we have two options. We have language and location. It's important to know if you have different language versions on the site that you're getting responses from those users. But also, it's good to know if we're getting traffic from sites in a language that we don't support. I'll scroll down to the table, and what I can see is the vast majority of our users are English speaking. However, over 3% of my audience speaks German, so it may mean that German speaking folks want the content that we have on our site. And it may make sense to create a German version of our content to engage German speakers. 3% isn't a huge amount of traffic, but I'm getting that without even trying to engage them. By creating a German locale, that might drastically go up. Before I decide that, I would want to look at conversions of German speakers. If our conversion percentage is high, or perhaps higher than English-speaking user conversions, it might make sense to create a German version. Then we have behavior reports. Behavior reports show us the extent at which we're finding first-time users and encouraging them to return to our site. This shows us how new and existing users use the site so we can identify patterns to see if conversions or sales are higher from one group to the other. Next is technology reports. These show us how people are connecting and consuming our content. And this is useful for several reasons, but one is, say we're adding a new feature to our site. We can use the browser report to decide whether or not we should spend any time making our site work on a certain browser. If only 1% of our traffic uses a particular browser, it may not make sense for us to spend the resources making the feature work perfectly for that browser. The flip side is, in my case, over 60% of my users use Chrome. So I need to make sure everything looks awesome and is functioning well in Chrome. The next is mobile reports. Mobile is such a big part of the way users are consuming content that Google has dedicated a whole section of reports to it. And I'm sure this will just grow over time. Since this is the case, it's very important that we understand what devices our audience is using, how they're inputting information, and even the screen size our information is being viewed on so that we can make sure that their experience with our content on those devices is awesome. And then we have benchmarking reports. Benchmarking allows us to compare our data with other industry data from companies who have opted to share it. This gives us some valuable context and helps us set up meaningful targets and even get some insight into trends occurring across our industry. An example of this might be a dip in traffic. Maybe we've noticed that in the fall we start to see a dip in traffic for a few months. And maybe this is something we're doing, but maybe it's also a trend across the industry. With benchmarking reports, we can find this out. The last report is users flow. This is a graphical representation of all the paths users have taken through our site. You see the origination point from various countries, to the first page that they hit, and how they travel throughout the site. Then the red is where the drop-offs have occurred. Okay, so that's an overview of each of the audience reports. What I'd like to do now is look more closely at audience demographics and interests. So now I'd like to discuss the Audience Demographics Overview Report for a moment. This is located under Demographics in the left-hand menu. The first thing we're going to see is Google's going to give us a breakdown of the ranges of visitors to our site during the time period that we've selected. And this is the bar graph on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to see a pie graph that breaks down our visitors by gender. You can already see that our site skews heavily towards males, and that's because of our products, I think. Then on the age bar graph, it's interesting to note that the primary age range of our visitors is 25 to 34. It accounts for over 40% of our traffic. My reaction to that is that I would have guessed 35 to 44 would be the predominant age range, but it's not even close. Then 18 to 24 and 45 to 54 are about even. When looking at this data, it's probably a good idea to view it through a large data range so we can see the data aggregated across as many users as possible. A weak view probably won't give you enough data to make any conclusions from, so I recommend grabbing 6 months or more. What's cool is we can modify our key metric. Right now it's on sessions, so this is showing us visits, but we can change it to things like bounce rate, pages per session, session duration, and percentage of new sessions. Let's take a look at what happens when we switch to bounce rate as the key metric. And that's interesting. As our demographic gets older, the bounce rate goes down. So while 18 to 24-year-olds are leaving the site after one page over 80% of the time, the bounce rate for 45 to 54-year-olds is almost half, at 47%. That's a huge difference. And we should consider how we're engaging each age group to figure out if we can either improve our bounce rate with younger visitors or if we can try to get more older traffic. And the bounce rate differences could be for a number of reasons. It could be content on the site, or it could be the user interface or design, but definitely something that we should look into. We can also look at pages per session, which is the number of pages a visitor looks at when they visit our site. This stays fairly even with the 4 older age ranges. It's the youngest age range that leaves the quickest. This could be a factor of, again, content, user interface, design, etc. Now, if you select this report and nothing is showing up, it's possible that you don't have demographics enabled in Google Analytics. Let me show you how to deal with this. Go to Admin in the top menu. Then make sure you're on the right account and property, and then choose Property Settings. In your property settings, you're going to scroll down to the bottom of the page. And where it says Enable Demographics and Interest Reports, make sure the toggle is on, and then hit Save down the bottom. Now let's go back to the age report under the demographics overview. And you'll notice that for me, the graph is not populating yet. I hadn't enabled the demographics until recently, so I think Google hasn't populated through everything yet. But I will call your attention to how you can manipulate the graph once data starts appearing. It's defaulted to sessions, which is normal, but we can change that metric to revenue or goal conversions. It's really handy to look at this graph in terms of which age group is converting so that you can try to engage more of that age group or even decide to figure out how to engage other age groups you think would be a good fit for your product or service. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see a breakdown of each age group and metrics regarding each range, like sessions, bounce rate, and pages per session. And while we could see some overall percentages regarding this data on the overview report, we couldn't see the actual data this specific. We can even bring in a secondary dimension up here if we wanted to look at, say, location data from each age range. Possibly we skew older in some areas and younger in others. Then we can also look up the gender report, which is located just below age. And just like the age report, Google hasn't populated the data all the way yet. I can see the far right-hand side, there is some graph data, looks like for one day. But over time, this will all fill out. If we scroll to the table below the graph, we can see the numbers of male sessions, bounce rate, etc. versus female. We can see the female bounce rate is about 10% higher than male visitors, but the session durations are about the same. Take some time to explore your audience demographics reports. It helps you to understand who your audience is so that you can decide what types of content you want to display for them. This site is definitely not as interesting to females as it is to males. And what we can discuss from there is why, and if it might make sense to reach out to or provide more content that women might find interesting, or even offer products that women might want. We can also use filters and segments to help show how this might change depending upon region or device usage. We might notice that our mobile users skew younger, and that if our site doesn't look good on a mobile device, that may account for why the bounce rate among the youngest age range is high compared to other age ranges. This type of information gives us the ability to do something about our reach. So that wraps up our audience reports overview and demographics reports. In the next video, we're going to discuss geographical reports.